Have you ever looked at someone and had no idea what they've been through? What if the man standing quietly behind you once saved lives, but you never even noticed? This story begins with Frank Miller, a quiet, older man in his late 70s. His back was a little hunched, and his hands showed the signs of time, wrinkled, rough, and a little shaky. Years ago, he wore a proud U.S. Army uniform. He had scars hidden once. And most of all, he had a heart full of memories, some too heavy to speak about, some too painful to ever forget. But there was strength in the way he stood. There was dignity in his silence. No one saw the man behind the coat. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He nodded politely to the cashier and smiled kindly at the child in front of him. He wasn't looking for respect, but deep inside, he hoped not to be disrespected. He wasn't loud, and he wasn't trying to be seen. He just came to buy a few simple things: milk, bread, and a box of tea. Frank was a retired soldier, a decorated war veteran. But now, he was just another old man in line at a grocery store. His objective today was simple: buy his groceries and go home. No trouble, no noise. He didn't want special treatment or attention. He had seen too much in life to expect kindness from strangers. All he wanted was a quiet day, a peaceful moment, and maybe a little respect if it came his way. He believed that a soldier's job is not to be remembered, but to serve when others can't. That belief had shaped his life. Even now, in his quiet old age, Frank walked with that same spirit. Calm, humble, proud, but never loud. Frank always carried a small badge and his veteran ID in his cloth bag, not to show off, but just in case. But inside, Frank carried stories of bravery, loyalty, and loss. He remembered every face he had served with, remembered the cold nights, the loud sirens, the letters from home, and the final goodbyes. That was his truth. That was who he really was. It reminded him of who he was, especially on days when the world seemed to forget. His mission wasn't just to survive. His mission was to live quietly with honor. After serving in war, facing loss, and carrying pain for years, now his goal was simple: dignity. He believed in doing the right thing without expecting thanks. Most people didn't notice him anymore. Some saw only his old shoes or his worn-out coat. But on this day at this grocery store, no one cared about that. As Frank waited in line, he stood silently with his bag close to his chest, his simple goal to be treated like a human being. But life had other plans. Today he would be mocked. Today someone would laugh at him, thinking he was just a poor old man. But by the end of this day, they would all know exactly who he was. Because Frank Miller, the quiet man in line, wasn't just another customer. He was a soldier, a leader, a hero, and his story was about to speak louder than any insult could. The line moved slowly. Frank stood calmly, his bag clutched in both hands. The store buzzed with the usual sounds: beeping scanners, plastic bags rustling, quiet chatter. People were tired, just trying to get through their day. Most of them didn't notice Frank, but one man did. A tall young police officer stood a few spots ahead. His uniform was pressed, his boots polished. He leaned toward the cashier and whispered something, then turned and glanced back at Frank. The officer smirked. "Looks like someone forgot what decade we're in," he said loudly. People turned. Eyes landed on Frank. The officer didn't stop. "That coat looks like it came from the last war." A few soft laughs followed. One woman even chuckled and covered her mouth. Frank looked down. His coat was old. Yes, but it had kept him warm. For years. It had been with him through cold nights, through hospital visits, through lonely walks home. It wasn't just fabric, it was part of his life. But now, it was a joke. The officer kept going. "Bet he's just here to warm up, not buy anything. Or maybe he's lost." He laughed at his own words. Frank said nothing. The cashier tried to ignore it. A few people smiled awkwardly, unsure what to do. Others looked at Frank and quickly looked away. No one said a word in his defense. The store became quiet, but not kind. Frank took a deep breath. He didn't want trouble. He never did. His mission was peace. His goal was dignity. But now the peace was broken, and the little dignity he carried in silence was being stripped. In front of strangers, inside, Something ached. It's not because he was hurt by a stranger's words, he had faced much worse, but because respect for age, service, and sacrifice seemed to have disappeared. This moment, this line at a grocery store, had become a battlefield of a different kind. Frank could feel people watching him, not with kindness, but with curiosity. The same way people look at something unusual, like he didn't belong there. But he stood tall, even if his back was bent. His lips stayed closed, even if his heart pounded. He didn't argue. He didn't fire back. Because this wasn't the first time someone had laughed at something they didn't understand. In war, he had faced bullets. Here, he faced laughter. One was loud, the other was quiet, but both could leave a mark. This was the conflicted moment that shook his peaceful mission. Frank wanted to shop and leave quietly. Instead, he was being publicly shamed for looking old, for being forgotten, for not matching the world around him, and the hardest part, no one stood up for him. Not yet. This conflict wasn't just between Frank and the officer, it was between what people think they see and what is really true. It was between youth and age, pride and humility, ego and honor. Frank didn't want to fight this battle, but sometimes silence is not enough. Sometimes the truth needs to be seen, and deep in his bag, under the groceries, lay something small, something powerful, something that would end the conflict not with words, but with truth. A badge, a card, a name that once stood for bravery. He hadn't wanted to use them, but maybe, just maybe it was time. Because dignity isn't given by clothes, it's earned by what a person has done, and Frank had done more than anyone in that room could ever imagine. Frank stood still, his bag in his hands, eyes fixed on the floor. The officer's laughter still echoed in the air, but the room had gone quiet. Everyone was watching now. A few looked down, embarrassed. Others kept staring at Frank, waiting to see what he'd say or do. But Frank didn't move. He could have spoken. He had words. He had a voice. Most importantly, he had the truth. But something held him back. In war, you don't always get to speak. You act, you protect, survive. And once the war is over, you carry that silence with you. Frank wasn't the kind of man who argued. He wasn't going to fight a young officer in a grocery store. That wasn't who he was. And it wasn't fear. It was something deeper. Obstacle number 1. His belief in silence. When the officer had joked, no one had stopped him. No one had said, "That's not right." No one had defended Frank. That made him think if he spoke now, would they even believe him? Or would they just laugh harder? Frank had spent most of his life learning how to stay calm. He had already fought enough battles. Obstacle number 2, his body. That doing the right thing meant staying humble. That medals belong in drawers, not on display. He was old now. His knees hurt. His shoulders ached. Couldn't move fast. He wasn't strong like he used to be. And Frank had never begged for anything in his life. He'd earned everything through sweat, service, and sacrifice. A younger man could have stood tall and spoken back. The officer was still smiling, clearly feeling proud of his joke. Frank's heart felt heavy. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a choice that had to be made. But Frank. Even standing too long was hard sometimes. The pain in his back reminded him of wounds, some from the battlefield. Others from years of working long hours after the war to build a quiet life. Obstacle number 3. The crowd. Frank could feel their eyes. He could feel the quiet judgment. He didn't want to pull out his badge and ID and say, "Look what I did." It felt wrong. It felt like begging for respect. It's a kind that should never have to be asked for. And yet, part of him wondered, was staying quiet the right thing today? Frank had always believed that a hero doesn't need to speak loudly, but today felt different. Today he wasn't being ignored. He was being humiliated. Still, something inside him kept saying, "Don't do it, Frank. Just let it go. You don't need to prove anything." But another voice, softer yet stronger, whispered, "Maybe they need to see, not for you, but for the truth. The truth that some people wear shiny uniforms but lack honor. The truth that real strength is quiet. The truth that respect should be given to those who earned it, not just those who look the part." And while Frank stood there, caught between silence and action, the line moved forward. To speak or not? To show them who he was, or keep it hidden. This moment wasn't about groceries anymore. It wasn't about clothes or jokes. It had become something bigger. A battle between pride and humility, past and present, truth and image. Frank was still unsure. He didn't want pity. He didn't want applause. He just wanted respect. But sometimes even the quietest heroes must speak, not with words but with proof. And that moment was now getting closer. Every story has a moment that changes everything. Quiet second, where the air shifts and people realize they were wrong. This was that moment. Frank stood at the front of the line now. Her eyes were soft, like maybe she saw something deeper. The officer, still smirking, had just paid for his items and was waiting nearby, looking amused. A few others in the line tried not to make eye contact. Inside, it was a faded ID card, and next to it, carefully wrapped in tissue, was a military badge. The corners of the card were bent. The photo on it was old. But the name was clear. Franklin J. Miller, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, retired. The room felt uncomfortable, like everyone knew something wasn't right, but no one wanted to be the first to admit it. The cashier smiled politely at Frank and said, "Next, sir." But she didn't laugh like the others. Frank took one slow step forward. His bag felt heavier than usual, not because of the groceries inside, but because of the decision he was about to make. He reached into the cloth bag and pulled out a small, worn-out leather wallet. The badge was a bronze star for bravery, awarded for saving over 30 lives during a combat rescue mission many years ago. The kind of medal not given lightly, the kind of story that doesn't need to be shouted to be known. Frank didn't wave it around. He didn't yell. He just placed the card and badge gently on the counter next to his items. No words. The cashier froze. Her eyes widened as she read the name and saw the medal. And the officer who just moments ago was the loudest voice in the room took a small step back. He didn't ask for an apology. That wasn't his way. He didn't need to win. He just needed the truth to be seen. The people behind Frank leaned forward, curious. Some heroes don't wear uniforms anymore, but they still carry the weight of honor. The officer's smile faded. Simply looked at the officer, calm, steady, silent. It wasn't anger in his eyes. It wasn't pride either. It was something stronger. Truth. Quiet truth that couldn't be denied. "What's that?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked just a little. Her voice was soft, but firm. "This man is a war hero." Frank still didn't speak. The cashier slowly picked up the ID and badge. "Sir, is this yours?" Frank gave a small nod. The cashier looked at the crowd, then at the officer. Silence. Pure, heavy silence. The laughter stopped. The smirks vanished. Heads turned. Eyes dropped. Frank didn't say, "I told you so." This was the premise of Frank's story, the core idea that was now out in the open. Never judge a man by his clothes, his age, or his silence. The room had changed. No one laughed now. No one dared. And still, Frank remained the same. Quiet, steady, dignified. Because he didn't bring out that badge to prove anything. He brought it out to remind everyone. Some things should never be forgotten. And now that they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. That was the moment the story truly began. The store was silent. The only sound was the soft beep of a barcode scanner in the background, but no one was moving. No one was talking. The people in that room didn't see an old man in worn-out clothes. They saw a soldier, a protector, a man who had given more to this country than most of them ever would. His eyes were still on the officer, the one who had mocked him minutes ago. He didn't glare. He didn't smile. Didn't expect anything. Frank had lived long enough to know that respect isn't something you can force. Everyone's eyes were now fixed on one man, Frank Miller. His smile was gone. His shoulders dropped. And for the first time since he entered the store, he looked ashamed. For the first time, this was the moment of main tension when everything hangs in the balance. What would the crowd do now? Would they stay quiet? Would they look away? Pretend nothing happened? He hadn't just embarrassed Frank, he had embarrassed himself. And now, in front of everyone, he knew it. Or would they finally do what should have been done from the start? Frank didn't move. The young officer looked down at the badge, then at Frank, then back down again. His face changed. He He opened his mouth, but no words came out. And yet a lesson had been learned by everyone in that room, a lesson that would stay with them far longer than anything they had come to buy. Not angry, not proud, just human. This was the culmination, the moment when everything the story had built toward finally broke through the surface. The sun peeked through gray clouds. Frank stepped onto the sidewalk, groceries in hand, and began walking home. About the bravery, about how they had almost missed seeing a real hero standing just a few feet away. And that was the day Frank Miller's quiet courage changed a room full of strangers. "Sir." Cashier stepped back and clapped once, twice. Slowly, then someone in the line joined in. Then another, and another, till the entire store stood still clapping for the man who had never asked for it, but had always deserved it. The officer didn't clap. He stood quietly, eyes on the floor. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Frank slowly nodded, not to say thank you, not to accept applause, but to acknowledge that, for once, the truth had been seen, and that was enough. The cashier gently handed back the ID and badge. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was clear. "Thank you for your service." Frank gave a soft smile and placed the items back in his bag. He paid for his groceries, took the receipt, and turned to leave. No victory speech, no dramatic moment, just dignity. This was the resolution. The battle was over, but no one had been hurt. No one had been yelled at. The officer took a deep breath and called out, "Sir?" "I'm sorry." Frank stopped. He didn't turn around, but he raised his hand in a quiet wave. Outside the store, the sky had started to clear. Behind him, people were still talking. But now, they weren't laughing. They were telling each other about Frank, about the badge. That was the day they stopped judging too quickly. That was the day silence spoke louder than words. Because some battles are not fought with weapons, but with patience, truth, and grace. So what is the theme of this story? It is simple, but powerful. Never judge someone by what you see on the outside. True respect is earned by actions, not appearances. Frank was just an old man in worn-out clothes. Most people didn't give him a second thought. He looked like someone who didn't matter, someone easy to ignore, or even laugh at. But the truth is, he had done more for his country than any of them had. He had once risked his life so that others could be free. He had been a soldier, a leader, a man of honor. But none of that was visible. It was hidden behind time, age, and silence. And that's what this story reminds us. We guarantee always know what someone has been through. The person next to you on the bus, in the shop, or walking down the street may have a story you can't even imagine. They may carry pain, sacrifice, and courage in their hearts, but show none of it on their face. In today's world, people move fast. They look quickly. They judge even faster. We scroll through lives on our screens and decide in seconds who someone is, based on what they wear, what they post, or how they speak. We forget to look deeper. Frank's story teaches us to stop and think. Frank never bragged about his past. He never wore his badge to show off. He didn't carry his ID to seek attention. It's part of many stories, like its stories of silent valor, where everyday heroes walk among us quietly. They don't demand attention, but they deserve our honor. He carried it to remember who he was, and to keep a part of those who never made it back. They might have fought for your freedom. They might carry medals you'll never see. They might be heroes with no spotlight. It teaches us to replace judgment with kindness, to replace laughter with listening, to replace ego with empathy. It's not in the clothes, it's in the character. Another theme that shines through is humility. He stayed quiet even when insulted. He stayed calm even when disrespected. That kind of strength is rare. It is easy to shout when you're angry. It is much harder to stay still, knowing the truth will speak for itself. And that is another message this story gives us. True strength is silent. The young officer wore a shiny uniform, but that day he learned what real honor looks like. The people in that store, they were changed too. They came into shop, but they left with something more. Respect. Real respect for the man they almost didn't see. This story is part of something bigger, so next time you see someone who looks different, older, quiet, don't be too quick to decide who they are. Remember this? Some of the strongest people walk the softest. Some of the bravest never say a word. And the people we often overlook, maybe the ones we should look up to the most. Every great story feels complete not just because of how it begins or ends, but because every part supports one clear idea. That's called unity, when everything in the story works together to deliver the same message. And from the first moment to the last, every piece of the story strengthens that message. In Frank Miller's story, the message is clear. Respect cannot be measured by how someone looks true. Worth comes from what someone has lived, done, and survived. Let's look at the opening. Frank walks into a grocery store, wearing old clothes. That small detail, the worn coat, the tired shoes, isn't random. It's the reaction of the crowd. The people around Frank laugh, or worse, they stay quiet. They are powerful symbols. Small, quiet, old, but filled with truth. To clapping, that shift is important. Ash shows how hearts can change when the truth is revealed. But when Frank leaves the store, the sun starts to come out. It's subtle, but it fits. The world has changed a little because people finally saw what was true. Their clapping is not just for Frank, it's for every person like him they've ever ignored. That applause becomes part of the emotional payoff. It unifies the audience with the story's deeper meaning. When Frank lays them on the counter, he doesn't say a word, yet everyone hears the message loud and clear. These items bring the story full circle. The man who looked like no one turns out to be someone unforgettable. Their silence is just as loud as the joke. That silence tells us something about human nature. We often go along with the loudest voice in the room. But when the truth comes out, we feel the shame of that silence. People laugh with him because he looks like someone to respect. Every part has a reason. And that's what makes stories like this powerful, because when everything works together, the message stays with you long after the video ends. But that is the contrast the story needs him in, who wears respect but hasn't he earned it, versus a man who earned it but no longer wears it. That contrast is what builds unity. Two characters standing for two very different kinds of honor. It's part of the story's foundation. His clothes are what lead others to judge him. Begins the tension. If Frank had been wearing a suit, no one would have said a word. His stillness shows self-control. His silence is a choice. His patience shows strength. The story doesn't need a loud fight to prove who the real hero is. It uses calm actions to create deep emotion. That calmness, again, supports the main message. Real heroes don't need to shout, but because he looked poor, people felt they had the right to mock him. That choice of clothing becomes the symbol of misunderstanding. Then we meet the young officer. He's not evil, he's just careless. He wears a clean, shiny uniform. He has authority. At the conflict, it's not just the officer's words. Frank's obstacles also tie into the theme. He doesn't speak, not because he's weak, but because he's wise. Even the badge and ID card are part of the story's unity. They are not just props. Then comes the crowd's change. They go from laughing. Even the weather outside supports the tone. At the beginning, the sky is gray, cold, and cloudy, just like people's attitudes. Everything in this story, every word, every action, every small choice points back to the same core message. Don't judge by appearances. Respect is something you earn, not something you wear. That's unity. It's what makes the story feel whole. Nothing is wasted. Nothing feels random.